All right, so now that we have gone through all the necessary anatomy, let's talk about the physiology of mastication and deglutition. We use the term mastication to mean chewing your food. Deglutition means swallowing. And we use the term bolus to refer to the liquid or the mass of food that you have prepared that you're going to swallow. So there are 4 stages of a normal swallow: oral preparatory stage, oral transit, pharyngeal, and esophageal. The oral prep stage is when the food gets to the mouth. Before the food gets to the mouth, like the spoon from the plate to your mouth, that is occupational therapy. So as a speech therapist, we don't work with getting the food to the mouth. But once the food is in the mouth, it becomes our responsibility. So food is in the mouth, the mandible is moving for the purposes of mastication, the tongue is moving the food around in your mouth, forming the bolus, moving it between your teeth as you masticate. The buccinators are tensing, keeping food in the oral cavity, keeping food from falling into the buccal cavities. Once the bolus has been prepared to a satisfactory level, you stop masticating. At this point, your tongue moves the bolus posteriorly in the oral cavity. It moves it back to the posterior fascial pillars. This is called anterior posterior transit, or AP transit. And this is the oral transit stage of the swallow. Some people simply refer to it as the oral stage of the swallow. As that bolus reaches the posterior fascial pillars, your swallow reflex or your pharyngeal swallow reflex is going to be triggered. So the pharyngeal swallow reflex it's going to be triggered either at the end of the oral transit stage or perhaps at the beginning of the pharyngeal stage of the swallow, and that's going to vary depending on just by person and maybe by the age of that person. So let's say bolus rolls off the back of the tongue through the posterior fascial pillars into the pharynx. Swallow reflex is triggered as the bolus enters into the pharyngeal stage of the swallow. When the swallow reflex is triggered, a number of things are going to happen. The velum is going to elevate to seal off the nasal cavity from the oral cavity to keep whatever it is that you're swallowing from getting into your nasal cavity. Your respiration is going to stop, and your larynx is going to be pulled up as your epiglottis is pulled down, and that is going to seal off the airway. And the true and the false vocal folds are going to be squeezed shut. So that creates 3 levels of protection for your airway. The opening to your esophagus, which is called the upper esophageal sphincter, is going to relax and open, and the pharyngeal constrictors are going to contract and squeeze the pharynx, which is going to safely propel that bolus through your pharyngeal cavity over the airway into the esophagus. All that happens as a result of the pharyngeal reflex or the pharyngeal swallow reflex or swallow reflex, depending on what term you want to use. What I mean by that is when that bolus passes into my pharynx, I'm not thinking to myself, I better raise my velum, I better raise my larynx and make sure my epiglottis is coming down and seal my vocal folds because I don't want anything getting in my airway, right? I don't think that. That's something that happens reflexively beneath the level of my awareness. That's my body protecting itself. But I can choose when to push that bolus back towards the pharynx, initiating the pharyngeal swallow reflex. And I can interrupt the pharyngeal swallow reflex if I have to. But once that bolus enters into the UES, the upper esophageal sphincter, the esophageal stage of the swallow, which is the last one, is entirely reflexive. I have no volitional control over that. So the esophageal stage of the swallow is essentially the esophagus just moving that bolus from the pharynx down into the stomach. All right, so let's look at a normal pharyngeal swallow. So this is not going to be the oral prep or oral transit stage, but just because when I talk about the pharyngeal swallow or the pharyngeal stage of the swallow, we talk about a lot of things happening. Velum elevates, epiglottis lowers, larynx pulls up, true false vocal folds close, UES relaxes and opens, pharyngeal constrictors constrict. Lots of things are happening, and I'm talking about them in a step-by-step manner to make it as clear to you as possible. But in reality, it's like these things are all happening simultaneously. So I'm going to play a video of a normal pharyngeal swallow. Okay, before we get to the swallow itself, let me orient you to what you're looking at. So here is the mandible. This is the ramus of the mandible. Anterior is here, Posterior is back here. So this is the front of the individual's neck. This white spot here, right there, that's the inside of the larynx. And you see this dark line, that is the esophagus. It's barium passing through the esophagus. So the pharynx is up here. So to illustrate to you how quick the pharyngeal swallow is, this is a person swallowing a thin liquid. It's that quick. So at the beginning of the video, you're seeing it start up here, and that's how quickly it passes through the pharynx. And at the end of it, you can see the epiglottis inverting is too quick to see, but you can see the epiglottis pop back up after the swallow. So here is, see, right now the pharynx is constricted. The bolus has just passed into the esophagus, and I'm going to hit play, and I'm going to try to catch the epiglottis popping back up right there. So the reason you have to know this information as the speech language pathologist about this information about a normal swallow is so that you can understand what's going wrong when people have swallowing disorders. So to contrast that normal swallow, I'm going to play for you a disordered swallow. And you're going to see how slow it is. You're going to see that there's lots of residue. All right. So lots of problems here. First of all, the first problem is you can see the bolus is just pouring into the pharynx, meaning there's no pharyngeal swallow. The pharyngeal swallow reflex hasn't happened yet. And as a result, you can see that you have parts of the bolus just piling into the vallecula and the piriforms above an open airway. And that's a dangerous situation. So the bolus is being allowed to get into the pharynx all the way down within it before the swallow reflex is cued. And then when the swallow reflex finally is cued, you're going to see some of this dark barium. It's not going to pass, most of it is going to pass posteriorly into the esophagus, but you're going to see some pass anteriorly into the larynx. Right there. So during the swallow reflex, a piece of that barium squeezed out into the larynx, and you see it right there. And that is barium. If I slow down, you can see it coming forward. The esophagus is back here. So all the barium should be moving just like that. but you see that there is a good chunk of it that is headed through the airway and not back here. And that part that is headed down south through the airway is headed to the lungs. This part here that's headed through the esophagus is going to the stomach. And then another problem is that you see after the swallow ended, there's still parts of the bolus in the pharynx. And that's a result of the lack of pharyngeal constriction. So you have the bolus getting into the pharynx without triggering the swallow reflex in a timely manner. You have, during the swallow reflex, clearly the airway is not being sealed by the epiglottis or the true and the false vocal folds. And the pharyngeal constriction isn't doing a very good job of making sure all that bolus is being squeezed into the esophagus.